Good morning, everybody. Thank you, first of all, for joining us today. My name is Tony Lemieux. I am co-director of the Atlanta Global Studies Center, one of the partners bringing you today's event. We are joined by Clemson University and our colleagues at Clemson, including Kyle Anderson, who is a co-organizer of this, and the University System of Georgia, where our colleague Tammy Rosner has been instrumental in putting this together as well, and Diana Wren-Rapp, also with the Atlanta Global Studies Center. One of the things that we are really looking forward to today is this sort of deep kind of engagement and the ability to have interaction. So as you have questions throughout the panel, just please use the chat box and we'll gather those and try to feed them into the discussion in real time as best we can. With that, I'd like to ask Kyle to do some introductions of our panelists. I'll come back to introduce our speaker, Jon Rubin, and we'll get underway.
Thanks very much, Tony. It's my pleasure to introduce our three panelists here, Dr. Wolfgang Schlur, Dr. Sharon Nagy, and Dr. Stephen Harmon. Dr. Wolfgang Schlur joined Georgia State University as Associate Provost for International Initiatives in 2017. He previously served as the Associate Provost for the Dieter Hennecke Institute for Global Education at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. He has a rich history as a researcher, conducting work at the Center for Science and International Affairs at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, and the Matthew Ridgway Center for International Security Studies in Pittsburgh. He conducted his PhD and MA studies in political science at the Freie Universität in Berlin. Welcome to the panel, Dr. Schlur. Dr. Sharon Nagy has served as Clemson University's Associate Provost for Global Engagement since August 2012. Under her leadership, Clemson has expanded the Office of Global Engagement beyond traditional student mobility to include partnership development for service learning and virtual exchange, as well as a robust curricular internationalization and faculty development initiative. Dr. Nagy was a 2013 Neal Presidential Fellow of the American Association of International Educators and now serves on the board. She is a board member of the ACE Center for Internationalization and Global Engagements Advisory Commission. Her work in cultural anthropology has been supported by Fulbright, Social Science Research Council, Ford and Rockefeller, and that has taken her through the Arabian Gulf states of Qatar and Bahrain. She has taught at universities in Egypt and Bahrain and led study abroad and field studies in Morocco, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. Welcome to the panel, Dr. Nagy. Dr. Stephen Harmon serves as the Associate Dean of Research at Georgia Tech Professional Education and is the Interim Executive Director of the Center for 21st Century Universities, and he's also a professor at the Georgia Tech College of Design. He is a former president of the Association of Educational Communications and Technology. Important moments in international education came for him when Dr. Harmon moved to Upper Egypt to teach English. While traveling there through the Middle East and Africa, he realized the tremendous need and scarce resources for education and training, and so he returned to the US where he earned his master's and doctorate in instructional technology and global policy studies. Welcome to the panel, Dr. Harmon.
Thank you very much.
And now I'd like to take a moment to introduce Jon Rubin. I have had the pleasure of knowing Jon for over 15 years now, when we were together at Purchase College, but his bio is incredibly impressive. From 1970 to 2005, Jon was primarily known as a filmmaker, media maker, and creator of a floating cinema. His efforts to develop collaborative online international learning, or Coil, grew from a cross-cultural video production class that he developed when he was doing a Fulbright in Belarus. He worked extensively to build out this concept and this idea, and was the founder and director of the State University of New York's Coil Center from 2006 to 2017. Jon organized and built virtual exchange opportunities and was a director of a National Endowment for Humanities funded center, Coil Institute for Globally Networked Learning in the Humanities. He's worked extensively across the globe, too many places to list in this introduction, but he has essentially stood up and supported numerous initiatives. Most recently, in 2017, he created Coil Consulting to support universities in developing their collaborative online international learning or virtual exchange efforts. He's written extensively on the topic. He's working on a book now, The Guide to Coil Virtual Exchange, which should be coming out in 2021 through Stylus Publishers, and is also deeply committed to helping with engaging and coming up with partnerships. And so he's working on the website and launching the website coilconnect.org to really help build that sort of network. So, I consider Jon to be a great colleague, a personal friend, and most importantly, every now and again in your career, you meet somebody and you work with them in a way that really changes the trajectory of things. For me, that was engaging in Coil, really early on in this, and really when Jon, came up with this great idea and said, "Hey, come out on this limb with me," I went, and I am grateful, and I think, here we are today. So, Jon, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tony. Maybe I'll immediately share my screen. And okay, the screen is there. All can see. So, thank you so much, Tony. Yeah, it's I still remember our first Coil-related encounter back at Purchase close to 15 years ago, where I tried to present the concept and you stood up and said, but is the institution really going to support this? And, that probably stayed with me as a hallmark of the question that we'll be discussing today, in fact. But let me, greetings from Brooklyn, New York. That's where I am at the moment. That's where my home office is, which you can see behind me. Many of us are in this situation these days. But let me begin by thanking the Atlanta Global Studies team and the organizing institutions, which have already been mentioned, for inviting me to speak to you. It's also really gratifying to see so many leaders, professors, and institutions presented here today. It just shows what's happening in our field. So you can see that this title slide depicts in the background the world upside down. However, when you think about it, this image of the world with the global south at the top is just as correct as is the map one usually sees. We are used to seeing North America and Europe at the top and center, so at first this view looks unfamiliar and it even looks wrong. But it's factually equally correct. Experiencing this different kind of view of the world and valuing that perspective is really a good metaphor for the hoped-for results from the Coil virtual exchange practices I will describe. I'll also get to talking about a few of the terms here because it is confusing. We're holding this session at what may be a critical moment in world history. The pandemic has shaken many facets of daily life, but it has also made it even more obvious how closely connected we all are. Clearly, with many of you registering for this session, and literally with thousands registering for other Coil virtual exchange workshops and webinars around the world, there is wide interest amidst the pandemic in exploring new ways to internationalize. Indeed, while COVID has been a tragedy for most of the world, interest in virtual exchange has grown because of it. And while my internet is excellent, there's always a chance there'll be some kind of glitch or problem. Let's hope that doesn't happen. If it does, it will likely pass quickly because I have good connectivity. But it's important to note that for many people in the world, lack of bandwidth is really a pervasive problem. And this affects their ability to stay connected online. So we need to take this into consideration as we design Coil exchanges. As we develop this model, we need to be inclusive, patient, and flexible. In fact, flexibility is probably the single most important quality for anyone engaging in Coil Virtual Exchange. In that sense, it may not be for everybody. In a moment, I'm going to discuss kind of the rational and underpinning of developing Coil. But first, this graphic illustrates the most basic Coil concept. A university lecturer and class in one country links online with a professor and his class in another country. Together, their students engage and develop joint projects. I'll return to describe the process in more detail in a few minutes, but this kind of gives you a grip, because I know that in this audience, we have a spectrum of people, from those who are practicing Coil to those for whom this visit might be their first engagement with the whole idea. So Coil's been around for over 20 years, but only in the past few years has it become widely implemented, especially at the post-secondary level. The exchange format actually began at the school level in the late 80s, as the internet first became viable, and only later propagated to the university. And even before then, even before the internet, there were pen pals and correspondence schools that utilized international email as their medium. And of course, there are books and movies and TV shows that are set in faraway places. So the desire and the experience of learning about the world from a distance is not entirely new. It's not strictly an internet phenomenon at all. You might think that because almost all of us are now engaged with online social networks that connect the world, and many of us teach online, why should we need virtual exchange? Wasn't the internet originally called the World Wide Net? What happened to that seemingly connected international structure? Unfortunately, as the internet was built out, unspoken agendas developed, and these were embedded in the sites we use every day. In our social networks, whether they be Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn or whatever we choose, we network only with those who are just like us. Even the software algorithms embedded in these apps are designed to let us find only those with whom we have the closest possible affinity. We exist in these online bubbles where we rarely encounter anyone different than us. Well, this may be useful when seeking a job or a mate, and it may even feel comfortable to be surrounded only by friends, but it prevents us from experiencing a larger and more diverse world while we are online. So the reality is that most university students around the world have little practical experience engaging those who think differently from themselves, even if they spend hours surfing the internet. In fact, probably the more they're on the internet, the less they're experiencing the world. So this is where virtual exchange comes in, through a range of structured approaches, because there's more than one format of virtual exchange. We engage various others in meaningful and productive ways. In order for these experiences to be valuable and transformative, they cannot be simple drop-in visits or lectures, but must involve significant interactions with new people who often live very different lives than do we. In the Coil virtual exchange model, student interactions usually last from 5 to 8 weeks, but this exchange follows months of collaborative design work by professors located in different countries. When successful, this process leads to the development of new relationships and understandings about another culture and also about oneself for both the participating students and the professors. And I just want to highlight that in many ways, Coil virtual exchange is at least as equally important for the teachers and professors. I would say in some cases, they're the ones that get the most out of it. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Now, in the time of the pandemic, even those who are fortunate enough to be able to participate in physical mobility previously can't travel. However, it should be noted that even before COVID, less than 8% of US post-secondary students were able to participate in physical mobility. So for the other 92%, really not much has changed. But the present nearly total stoppage of travel has forced those of us who have been supporting intercultural and international exchange to seek new ways to connect with the world, and that's why we're here today. Tony already spoke a little about this, but I'll just add a few words. My own interest in this grew out of a cross-cultural video production course that I developed after spending a semester in the country of Belarus in Eastern Europe on a Fulbright way back in 1999. So my good fortune in being able to participate in physical mobility helped me to understand how important these experiences were. Tony also mentioned that my background is in media, and I really had this drive to connect the students who I met in Minsk, in Belarus, with my students in the US, because I felt they would have so much to say to each other. But I knew they were not going to visit. No American was going to Belarus except me. And Belarusians didn't have the money to travel unless they were escaping completely. We know the problems in Belarus at the moment that we unfortunately can't explore in this meeting. So we created small intercultural student teams that work together between these two cultures, sequentially sending scenes back and forth across the internet while students reflected on this process, often surprising each other with what emerged. This took place in 2002, at least the first iteration, which was way before YouTube and Facebook even existed. And it was a real challenge doing it back then. Bandwidth was really little, especially in Belarus. But the course was such a revelation to me and my students that it sent me down a new career path, eventually to develop Coil. So Coil is really a method of repurposing the tools we already have in online education so they serve a new goal, that of providing meaningful international experiences for students and instructors. And while many universities collaborate internationally on research, few have significant experience with intensive collaborative networking in pedagogy. To do so often requires engaging in a deep intercultural reexamination of why and how each local class is organized and assessed, which can be a potentially radical and revealing intervention for students, instructors, and staff. So if you're going to collaborate with a class in another country, they're probably doing a lot of things different than you are. And that's something you must explore if you really want to have an equitable engagement. So it's very transformative because of that necessity. So there are many names for Coil-related practices. I'm going to do this very fast because we just don't have the time. And I just will say this is an enormous problem in the field, that people are calling the same or similar things by many different names. So telecollaboration, for instance, was a term for people doing this for language learning. So a class in Italy learning English would meet with a class in the States learning Italian. They would learn their languages, and they would also learn a lot about each other's culture. Virtual exchange is the term that we're using here primarily. It's an extremely broad term. Virtual exchange means many different things. Globally networked learning was a term that we originally used at the SUNY Coil Center. It was a term that was developed by a Canadian researcher named Doreen Stark-Meyering. Virtual mobility is still another term, and this is one that's less prevalent in the States, but it's very evident in Europe and Mexico, and it's a very different concept, but the name sounds so similar that people get them mixed up. In virtual mobility schemes simply mean that students can enroll in another university, in another country, in their online classes, period. That's really all it means. So there's some sense that by being in this class in another country, they're having an international experience. But in the virtual mobility scheme, the professor may not even know that student is there. That is, there's no attempt to change the class structure to engage the interculturality of the potential, but it's much easier administratively to do something like this. It's just, you just enroll the student and that's the end of the discussion. So I'm not a big supporter of virtual mobility. I don't think it's very transformative. Coil virtual exchange is the term that I'm mostly using now because I see Coil as a more specific definition. So it's like virtual exchange is like sports, saying sports. Coil is like saying basketball. And basketball kind of has rules. Sports doesn't really have rules. So that's why I've kind of leaned in this direction, and that's the term I'm primarily using. Teletandem is another language learning model. And these last two are examples. Global learning experience is used by DePaul. EDGE is used by Penn State. Many universities are now giving names to their own COIL or virtual exchange programs. It's branding. And of course, everyone likes to do that. But the problem is, it's very hard to sort this. So if you ask somebody at DePaul, are you doing COIL? If they're sophisticated about it, they'll know. But they might say, no, we do global learning experience. But it's really almost the same thing. So this is the field we're in right now. It's an expanding, changing field with very little top-down structure. So here is a very simple definition of COIL virtual exchange that I happen to like. It says that it utilizes the internet to empower instructors around the world to develop curiosity, flexibility, and generosity in concert with academic partners, benefiting two or more classrooms of collaborating students, usually located in different countries, who've had different life experiences. I like it because of its openness. It's not really about the course content. It's about the other things that happen in the classroom. And I should also add, it says usually located in different countries. There are a number of us who are now exploring doing COIL that's national or regional. For instance, I've just helped some folks set up a COIL between a community college in West Virginia and one in Queens, New York. Those are obviously very different cultural settings, and I think that's an interesting direction for COIL. So there's a lot of detail in these next slides. I'm going to go as quickly as I can. First is that it's embedded in accredited courses. It's not extracurricular. At least the COIL model is not extracurricular, and the work done is always assessed. It could be graded, it could be just pass-fail, but the work is not optional. It's required. It's co-developed by teachers in different cultures or locations, and usually taught by these same instructors. This is an almost ironic slide in the present context. Until this year, most COIL courses were face-to-face classrooms where the only online engagement was the COIL piece. Now, with most classes online, there's been a radical shift. But historically, and I suppose in the future, COIL will often reside in non-online classrooms. It's collaborative project work between diverse student cohorts. Sometimes in presentations, I spend some time talking about the word collaboration because I think it's so critical. I'm not going to belabor it now, but I think it's important to note that if there isn't collaboration between the student cohorts, it's not COIL. It's not getting into that deeper level. It seeks relative equity and active participation from all enrolled students. Well, that's fine to say, but given the different cultural backgrounds of different students, this is not always so easy to achieve. So the teachers really need to design the course such that everybody will be engaged as much as possible. Language fluency is a key piece. We could do an entire session on the language aspects of COIL. Many COIL classes are in English, but many partners of US institutions, English is not their first language, and the level of fluency in English varies greatly. So this is something that one really has to think about. One does not have to work with groups that are equally fluent in the same language. There are a lot of techniques one can use to work with folks whose language is a little different in emphasis. So for instance, you can have students who are more fluent, let's say in English, if we're staying on that channel, work with the students who are less fluent. So you end up getting group activity around language, even if the class has nothing to do with language. It often links courses from different disciplines, and this is not obvious to people just getting involved in this, but it's really key. I would say most COIL courses are interdisciplinary. Not sure I could prove that that's correct, that saying most, but from my experience, many are. It's typically embedded into pre-existing courses. Why is this? Well, to get a new course off the ground, especially one that's a bit radical, as is COIL, could take a year, it could take 2 years. And we want to move more quickly than that. So we learn through experience that it's easier and faster, and in some ways makes more sense to embed it in a pre-existing course. And 5 to 8 weeks is a good length of time to do it. less is not enough for the students to get to know each other, and more can be problematic for other reasons. And as I've been saying from the beginning, this is usually an intervention into normal university practices at one or both institutions. This is not just a little minor add-on. It's a real shift. And I would say now, and this is a recent change, but I think it's critical. In the early days, most COIL initiatives were individuals, actually, like myself, reaching out to somebody abroad and kicking this off because I thought it was interesting. But there's really limitation to the sustainability and scalability of that model. And so in the last few years, and especially this year, more and more universities are committing to it structurally and committing staff to it. And I think that's absolutely critical. I've seen too many unfortunate COIL initiatives where one poor teacher filled with enthusiasm when she first put her foot in the water is now 2 years later trying to manage 6 COIL courses without any real direct support. That doesn't really work. So this slide kind of captures the real challenge of COIL course development. I've been talking about this already from the beginning, but the slide kind of hits it on the head. There's a lot of 2s there on the left and some 1s on the right, and it takes a lot of effort to make this all work, but it pays off. This slide will take too long to go over in detail, but I do want to spend a minute on it. And you notice here, it says 4 to 12 week collaboration. Well, this is part of the issue of COIL. I mean, a friend gave me this slide and I just used it as it is. I should have probably edited it. But different people approach it differently. Some schools might consider a 3-week engagement a COIL class. Another might say, well, if it's not at least 5 weeks, it's not COIL. So there's a lot of interpretation here locally, but you also have to share your interpretation with your partner institution because they have their own interpretation. You can't do COIL yourself. It's one of the few things in higher education that a university can't simply decide to do, and if it has resources, act on it. You're doing it in partnership with other institutions, and you have to bring them along, and they have to provide their own insights so that it's not a kind of colonizing experience. So typically in a class, there's an early period where students need to get to know each other. You use icebreakers and other tools to create some kind of a kindred spirit among the students. If you skip this first stage, it's almost certain that your COIL class will not be successful. You also need some time for students to get comfortable with the software. It's likely that one of the 2 groups, if there are 2, is new to the software. Maybe both are. So you need a little time for people to know what buttons to click. Then you move into doing a smaller project. Then after another week or 2 into a larger project that requires research and problem solving. And then finally, some kind of a presentational or reflective moment at the end where students see each other's work to some degree and reflect on what the experience was about. I will not be getting into a discussion of assessment in the few minutes I have left, but I just want to emphasize reflection in these courses is an absolute critical part of the conclusion if it isn't already embedded in a summative way during the course. Students really need to be given the space to think about what happened to them. So here, I'm just going to throw a few examples at you now before we wind down. I want to show you the interdisciplinarity of this. So these are kind of, the second one especially is extreme. This took place towards the end of my time at SUNY 4 years ago. So here's an environmental science course working with a sociology course. This to me is a really good model for how these things can be brought together. In this case, you have expertise of the students and teachers in environmental science blending with the expertise of the students in sociology. This is what happens in the real world. You don't, for the most part, sit in your own little niche. You work with others to develop outcomes. And that's why interdisciplinary courses, I think, are so exciting. Here's another example of I'll call this a quasi-interdisciplinary course because the 2 fields are closer, at least, than the ones we just saw. So these were nursing students in South Africa and nutrition students. This was also at a SUNY community college, focusing on diet and nutrition. These students went into their communities and interviewed people to find out what they were eating, and especially what children were eating. And then came back together to do an analysis of what might be better and what might be a problem, etc. In doing this, they had to also understand the economics of these families, some of which had very little money to purchase food. And ultimately, they also had to learn about what food it was, because the students in New York, for instance, didn't know what about half of the foods that were being eaten in South Africa were by name. They just didn't know what they were, and vice versa to some degree. So they learned a lot about each other's culture while they were studying this subject matter that was borderline between their two disciplines. This is a fairly complex course I'll just mention because it's a four-way and it's a graduate level course in production management. This was a case where the students at grad level had to develop a production management plan for a building that would be built in one of the other countries. So they had to learn from the other students what this procedure would be like. And many of them were shocked how different it was. That is, to build a building in Turkey is really different than building it in the US. It's not that the science is different, but all of the pragmatics of getting approvals, I'm not an engineer myself, etc., are really different. So it was very challenging for the students, and in the end, they were assessed by an expert in the country for which they were doing the production management design. So the US students would present this to a Turkish expert, and if he was convinced that they could do the job, they got a good grade. If he wasn't convinced, they got a bad grade. So it was very real world in that sense. Now, in general, Coil is a training ground for working in virtual teams. Many of us are now working remotely, but virtual teams are more and more prevalent as a way to manage. Although Coil courses are not usually, they sometimes are explicitly designed to train students for virtual teamwork, they offer some of the structural challenges and opportunities and really provide a kind of training in this type of work. Coil is a revenue neutral model. The money is paid only locally. There is no exchange of monies for the most part. That makes it very different than most other international experiences. And although Coil exchanges are about the teachers and the students, in the end, the professors need to know that senior leadership, deans, chairs, etc., will support them. It doesn't really work well when you just put the teacher out there to do it themselves. And this is something we're learning, and there's not time here to get into any detail about it. This is a slide I've shown, I don't know how many times. There isn't time again to describe it, but the basic concept is that we're trying to get our students out to the world. It requires international programs, faculty, technology, and administrative support to get them there. And there are these creatures in the sea that may devour them of the bridge. And the one I'll point to as I rush to complete this presentation is faculty staff overload. That crab, if I were to redo this graphic, which I've been showing, I think, for 12 years, would probably be almost the size of the bridge, because the other three are relatively less important. We use technology so much, and we have so much technology that I don't think that's an issue, but faculty are really overloaded all the time, and now we're asking them to do something very exciting, but more. And I don't know if it's always possible. So this is a list of some topics of why you should engage Coil. I've covered most of them here, and I can share the PowerPoint with you if you wish. I want to wrap this up because I'm a couple minutes over already. And I just want to say thank you very much for hearing me out. And I will leave with the slide that is a reference to the beginning of this. So thank you.